When Special Agent Marcus Johnson boarded Flight 47 from New York to Los Angeles that Tuesday morning, he had no idea that showing his first-class ticket would lead to the most humiliating experience of his 15-year FBI career. The flight captain took one look at the young black man in the expensive seat and immediately assumed he didn't belong there, loudly announcing that business class isn't for black passengers and that there must have been a system error. What happened next would be captured on passenger phones and viewed by millions, because the man they were trying to remove wasn't just any traveler. He was a federal agent returning from a classified mission, and he was about to teach everyone on that plane what happens when you discriminate against someone with a badge and the authority to back it up. The morning sun gleamed off the wings of the Boeing 777 as passengers boarded Flight 407 at JFK International Airport. It was 9:30 a.m., and the aircraft was preparing for a cross-country flight to Los Angeles International Airport. Among the travelers settling into their seats, 34-year-old FBI Special Agent Marcus Johnson made his way down the aisle toward seat 2A in the business class cabin. Marcus wore a simple navy suit and carried a leather briefcase, looking like any other business traveler heading to the West Coast. But inside that briefcase were classified documents related to a federal investigation he'd just completed in New York, and in his jacket pocket was his FBI badge and credentials, symbols of 15 years spent fighting organized crime and protecting American citizens. Today's flight was officially a business trip. Marcus was returning to Los Angeles after wrapping up a multi-state investigation into human trafficking operations. His federal travel authorization had automatically booked him in business class, as was standard protocol for senior agents on official missions. He'd earned this seat through years of dangerous work, late nights, and putting his life on the line for his country. As Marcus settled into his assigned seat and stowed his briefcase, he noticed the flight attendants preparing for departure. The cabin was about half full, with the usual mix of business travelers, vacationers, and a few families heading to California. Everything seemed routine until Captain Robert Stevens emerged from the cockpit to conduct his pre-flight cabin inspection. Captain Stevens was a 25-year veteran of commercial aviation who had developed what he considered keen instincts about passengers and potential problems. When his eyes fell on Marcus, something triggered his assumptions about who belonged in the premium cabin and who didn't. "Excuse me," Captain Stevens said, approaching Marcus's seat with an expression that immediately suggested trouble. "I need to see your boarding pass." Marcus looked up from his phone, where he'd been reviewing case notes. "Certainly, Captain." He retrieved his boarding pass from his jacket pocket and handed it over with the same professional courtesy he'd learned during his FBI training. Captain Stevens examined the boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny, looking from the document to Marcus's face and back again. His expression grew more skeptical by the second. "There seems to be some kind of problem here," Captain Stevens announced, his voice loud enough for passengers throughout the business class cabin to hear. "This doesn't look right to me." Marcus felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd experienced this kind of scrutiny before, but never so publicly and never from someone in a position of authority on a commercial flight. "I'm sorry, Captain, but what kind of problem?" Marcus asked, maintaining his professional composure despite the growing tension. "Well," Captain Stevens said, holding up the boarding pass like it was evidence in a criminal investigation, "it's obvious you don't belong here. Business class isn't for black passengers. This is clearly some kind of system error or mistake." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In 15 years of federal law enforcement, he'd faced down dangerous criminals, testified in federal court, and risked his life in undercover operations. But this moment of casual public discrimination cut deeper than any professional challenge he'd ever faced. "Captain, I can assure you that my boarding pass is legitimate," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. "I'm traveling on official business." Captain Stevens laughed dismissively. "Official business? Right. Look, I've been flying for 25 years, and I know who belongs in business class and who doesn't. Young black men don't typically have the means for seats that cost $3,500. By now, Other passengers in the cabin were turning to watch the confrontation. Several people were pulling out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. The atmosphere on the plane had shifted from the usual pre-flight calm to something more tense and charged. "There's obviously been some kind of mistake with your reservation," Captain Stevens continued, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. "Probably a computer glitch, or maybe someone used a stolen credit card. Either way, you're going to have to move to economy where you belong." Marcus felt every eye in the business class cabin focused on him. Passengers were whispering, phones were recording, and he could imagine the headlines: "Black passenger removed from first class for not belonging." "Captain," Marcus said, his voice taking on the quiet authority he'd developed during years of interrogating suspects, "I purchased this seat legitimately, and I have every right to sit here." "Listen," Captain Stevens said, his tone becoming more aggressive. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running or how you got hold of this boarding pass, but you're not staying in business class. That's fine." What Captain Stevens didn't know was that Marcus Johnson wasn't just any passenger trying to defend his seat. He was a federal agent with 15 years of experience, extensive training in civil rights law, and the authority to investigate exactly the kind of discrimination he was experiencing. More importantly, Captain Stevens had no idea that Marcus was carrying federal credentials that would completely change the dynamic of this confrontation. "Captain Stevens," Marcus said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket, "before you continue with this conversation, I think there's something you should see." "I don't want to see anything except you moving to economy," Captain Stevens replied dismissively. "This discussion is over." But Marcus was already retrieving his FBI credentials from his jacket pocket. The leather wallet containing his badge and federal identification caught the cabin lighting as he opened it, revealing the unmistakable symbols of Federal Law Enforcement Authority. "Special Agent Marcus Johnson, Federal Bureau of Investigation," Marcus said quietly, holding his credentials where Captain Stevens could see them clearly. "I'm traveling on official federal business, and I'd like to continue this conversation with that information in mind." The change in Captain Stevens's expression was immediate and dramatic. The confident authority he'd been wielding just seconds earlier evaporated as he processed what he was seeing. The color drained from his face as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. You're..." Captain Stevens stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's correct," Marcus replied, his voice remaining calm and professional. "Special Agent Johnson, 15 years with the Bureau. I'm returning to Los Angeles after completing a federal investigation in New York." The business class cabin had gone completely silent. Every passenger was watching the interaction, many still recording with their phones. The flight attendants had stopped their pre-flight preparations to observe what was clearly a significant moment. "Sir, I had no idea," Captain Stevens said, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Marcus repeated, his voice gaining an edge that his fellow agents would have recognized immediately. "Captain, you told me that business class isn't for black passengers. You accused me of using a stolen credit card and said I don't belong here. That's not a misunderstanding. That's discrimination." Captain Stevens looked around nervously, suddenly aware that dozens of passengers were recording the interaction and that his discriminatory comments had been captured on multiple devices. "I was just following standard procedures," Captain Stevens said weakly, trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. "Standard procedures?" Marcus asked, his voice taking on the tone he used when questioning suspects. "What standard procedures involve telling passengers that their race disqualifies them from certain seating areas?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone on the plane could see exactly what had happened, and Captain Stevens had no reasonable explanation for his behavior. "Show me where in your airline's policies it says that black passengers can't sit in Indus class," Marcus continued, his federal training and civil rights law coming to the forefront. "Show me where it says you can question someone's right to travel based on their race." Captain Stevens opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was completely trapped by his own discriminatory statements, all of which had been recorded by multiple passengers. But Marcus wasn't finished with his lesson in federal law and civil rights. "Captain Stevens," Marcus said, "as a federal agent, I'm required to inform you that what you've done here constitutes discrimination based on race, which is a violation of federal civil rights laws. Specifically, you violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination in places of public accommodation. The legal weight of Marcus's words settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. Passengers were realizing they weren't just witnessing a travel inconvenience, they were watching a federal civil rights violation unfold in real time. Furthermore, Marcus continued, your statements about black passengers not belonging in business class constitute a pattern of discriminatory behavior that suggests this isn't an isolated incident. Captain Stevens was visibly sweating now, realizing that his career was probably over and that he was facing potential federal investigation. Sir, please, Captain Stevens said desperately, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I would never intentionally discriminate against anyone. The evidence suggests otherwise, Marcus replied calmly. You made specific statements about my race and what you believed I could or couldn't afford. You accused me of criminal activity without any evidence, and you did all of this in front of witnesses. Senior flight attendant Patricia Wong, who had been watching the interaction with growing alarm, approached cautiously. Agent Johnson, she said respectfully, on behalf of the airline, I want to apologize for this situation. This is absolutely not how we treat our passengers. Marcus turned to Patricia, his expression softening slightly. Ms. Wong, I appreciate your apology, but this isn't just about customer service. This is about federal civil rights law and the systematic discrimination that many passengers face when they try to travel. What can we do to make this right? Patricia asked, genuinely concerned about the legal and public relations nightmare that was unfolding. First, Marcus said, I'm going to need to speak with your airline's corporate headquarters about this incident. Second, I'm going to need copies of all company policies related to passenger seating and discrimination. And third, I'm going to need a full report of this incident filed with the appropriate federal agencies. Captain Stevens realized that his discriminatory comments had not only been morally wrong, but it also triggered a federal investigation that would likely end his career and potentially expose the airline to significant legal liability. Agent Johnson, Captain Stevens said quietly, I want to apologize personally for my statements. They were wrong, and they don't represent the values of this airline. Marcus looked at the captain who had humiliated him just minutes earlier. Part of him wanted to accept the apology and move on, but he knew that discrimination persisted because people were allowed to apologize without facing real consequences. Captain Stevens, Marcus said, your apology is noted, but apologizing doesn't undo the discrimination, and it doesn't address the fact that other passengers have likely been treated the same way. The truth of Marcus's statement resonated throughout the cabin. Several passengers were nodding in agreement, and some were sharing their own experiences of discrimination while traveling. Patricia Wong stepped forward again. Agent Johnson, what would you like us to do moving forward? Marcus considered the question carefully. He could demand that Captain Stevens be removed from the flight, file immediate federal complaints, and turn this into a major incident, but he also recognized an opportunity to create positive change. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus said, his voice taking on the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Captain Stevens is going to personally apologize to every passenger on this plane for his discriminatory behavior. The airline is going to provide me with a written report of this incident within 48 hours, and your company is going to implement a mandatory civil rights training for all employees. Absolutely, Patricia said immediately. We'll make sure all of that happens. And one more thing, Marcus added. I want this incident reported to the Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Enforcement and Proceedings. Discrimination in commercial aviation is a federal matter, and it needs to be handled at the federal level. Captain Stevens nodded miserably, realizing that his discriminatory comments had triggered a chain of events that would likely end his career and expose his airline to federal scrutiny. But Marcus wasn't done teaching his lesson about the consequences of discrimination. He understood that this moment represented more than just his personal vindication. It was an opportunity to educate everyone on the plane about civil rights and the ongoing challenges faced by travelers of color. Captain Stevens, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Before we continue, I want you to understand the full scope of what's happened here. You violated multiple federal laws, including the Civil Rights Act of 1960. These aren't minor infractions. They're serious federal offenses that carry significant penalties. The captain's face went even paler as he realized the legal implications of his actions. Agent Johnson, I never intended to break any law. I was just following what I thought were proper procedures. Proper procedures? Marcus asked, his tone sharp. What procedure tells you to assume a black passenger can't afford business class? What procedure allows you to accuse someone of criminal activity based solely on their race? The questions hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Captain Stevens had no legitimate explanation for his behavior, and everyone on the plane could see that clearly. Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small recording device. Captain Stevens, I'm going to need you to provide a full statement about this incident for my federal report. Everything you've said and done here today will be documented and forwarded to the appropriate authorities. The sight of the recording device made Captain Stevens even more nervous. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just an embarrassing moment that would blow over, it was a federal investigation that would follow him for the rest of his career. Furthermore, Marcus continued, I'll be contacting the Federal Aviation Administration about your fitness to hold a commercial pilot's license. Discrimination against passengers raises serious questions about judgment and character that the FAA takes very seriously. Patricia Wong stepped forward again, her face showing genuine concern. Agent Johnson, what can our airline do to demonstrate that this behavior doesn't represent our company values? Marcus appreciated her professionalism, but he also knew that real change required more than just words. Ms. Wong, I'm going to need to see your company's anti-discrimination policies, training records, and complaint procedures. I want to know if this is an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. Of course, Patricia replied immediately. We'll provide whatever documentation you need. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus said, addressing the entire business class cabin, my name is Special Agent Marcus Johnson, and I've been an FBI agent for 15 years. What you witnessed here today was racial discrimination. Plain and simple. The passengers were listening intently, many still recording with their phones. Captain Stevens assumed that because I'm black, I couldn't afford a business class seat, Marcus continued. He accused me of criminal activity without evidence, and he told me I didn't belong here based solely on my race. Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the cabin. Several passengers called out expressions of support for Marcus. This kind of discrimination happens every day to travelers of color, Marcus said. Most of the time, people don't speak up because they don't want to cause trouble or because they don't think anyone will believe them. The educational moment was powerful and impactful. Passengers were realizing that they had witnessed something significant, and many were expressing their intention to report the incident to the airline and federal authorities. But I'm a federal agent, Marcus continued, and I have the training and authority to address this kind of discrimination when I see it. Not everyone has that advantage. Captain Stevens stood silently, absorbing the full weight of what his discriminatory behavior had triggered. He was facing potential federal investigation, career termination, and public humiliation that would follow him for the rest of his life. As the plane prepared for departure, Patricia Wong approached Marcus again. Agent Johnson, I want you to know that this incident will be fully investigated, and there will be consequences for what happened here today. I appreciate that, Marcus replied. But the real test will be whether your airline makes meaningful changes to prevent this from happening to other passengers. The flight proceeded to Los Angeles without further incident, but the impact of what had happened would extend far beyond the 5-hour journey. The videos recorded by passengers went viral within hours, sparking nationwide conversations about discrimination in air travel. Captain Stevens was suspended pending investigation and ultimately fired by the airline. The incident led to mandatory civil rights training for all airline employees and new policies designed to prevent discrimination against passengers. Marcus received formal apologies from the airline's CEO and the Department of Transportation. His handling of the situation was praised by civil rights organizations and law enforcement agencies alike. But perhaps most importantly, the incident became a powerful example of how to respond to discrimination with dignity, authority, and a commitment to creating positive change. The viral videos of the confrontation were viewed millions of times, educating people about civil rights laws and the ongoing challenges faced by travelers of color. The incident became a case study in business schools and law enforcement training programs. Captain Stevens learned a costly lesson about the consequences of discrimination and prejudice. His career in aviation was over, but his case became a cautionary tale that helped prevent similar incidents. Marcus Johnson continued his FBI career, using his experience on Flight 47 to advocate for civil rights and educate others about the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or appearance. The airline implemented comprehensive changes to its policies and training programs, becoming a leader in anti-discrimination practices within the aviation industry. The aftermath of Flight 47 would ripple through the aviation industry for months to come. Within 24 hours of the viral videos being posted, the airline's stock price dropped by 3%, and the company's customer service lines were flooded with calls from outraged passengers demanding explanation. Marcus Johnson's calm, professional handling of the discrimination had turned him into an unlikely hero. Civil rights organizations praised his response, noting how he had used his federal authority not to intimidate or seek revenge, but to educate and create meaningful change. The Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into the airline's practices, interviewing dozens of current and former employees about potential patterns of discrimination. What they found was troubling. Captain Stevens' behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader culture that had allowed discriminatory attitudes to persist unchecked. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus received a call from the airline's new CEO, who had been brought in specifically to address the company's discrimination problems. Agent Johnson, the CEO said, "I want to personally thank you for bringing this issue to our attention. Your actions have helped us identify and address serious problems in our corporate culture." The airline implemented a comprehensive reform program that became a model for the entire industry. New training protocols, revised hiring practices, and an independent oversight committee were established to ensure that discrimination would not be tolerated at any level of the organization. Captain Stevens, meanwhile, struggled to find employment in aviation after his termination. The viral videos had made him unemployable in the industry, and he eventually took a job as a flight instructor at a small regional airport, where he spent his time teaching young pilots about the importance of treating all passengers with respect and dignity. The incident had cost him his career, his reputation, and his livelihood. But in interviews months later, Stevens admitted that the confrontation with Agent Johnson had forced him to confront his own prejudices and become a better person. "I was wrong," Stevens said in a televised interview 6 months after the incident. "Agent Johnson showed me that my assumptions about people based on their race were not only morally wrong, but also completely inaccurate. I lost everything because of my prejudice, but maybe that's what needed to happen for me to learn this lesson." The story of Flight 447 became required reading in business ethics courses and civil rights training programs across the country. Marcus Johnson was invited to speak at conferences and seminars, sharing his experience and teaching others how to respond to discrimination with dignity and effectiveness. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the hundreds of messages Marcus received from other travelers who had faced similar discrimination. Many thanked him for standing up and showing them that they didn't have to accept unfair treatment. Others shared their own stories of discrimination and expressed hope that his actions would help prevent future incidents. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter from a young black college student who had seen the viral video. The student thanked Marcus for standing up to discrimination and said that seeing a federal agent defend his rights had inspired him to pursue a career in law enforcement. That letter reminded Marcus why his response to discrimination had been so important. It wasn't just about defending his own rights, it was about standing up for everyone who faced similar challenges and showing them that dignity and justice were worth fighting for. The legacy of Flight 47 extended far beyond one plane or one airline. It became a symbol of how individuals with authority and courage can create positive change, and how standing up to discrimination benefits everyone, not just those who are directly affected. The incident on Flight 47 lasted less than 30 minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come. It was a reminder that discrimination persists in many forms, but that people with authority and courage can make a difference when they choose to stand up for what's right. Marcus Johnson had spent 15 years fighting crime as an FBI agent, but on that Tuesday morning at 30,000 feet, he fought something equally important: the prejudice and discrimination that too many people face every day. In the end, justice was served not by courts or committees, but by one federal agent who refused to accept discrimination and used his authority to create positive change. He had shown that heroes don't always wear uniforms, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought in the most ordinary places. Marcus Johnson returned to his FBI duties, but he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important law enforcement happens not in criminal investigations, but in everyday moments when people choose to stand up for justice and human dignity. If this story moved you, remember that discrimination still happens every day, and every person has the right to be treated with dignity and respect. Subscribe for more stories of courage and justice, and share this reminder that real change happens when good people refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice.